Okay, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined by Mr. Ashley Perry, who is an advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, joining us to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do so by using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your browser window. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Achnaf, and good evening from Israel. There'll be a major decision tomorrow on the future of the war, doing something that arguably hasn't been done before. There'll be a security cabinet, the full security cabinet, is my understanding, and they'll be making a decision on how to move forward after the negotiations have stalled now for a number of weeks, ostensibly because Hamas have walked away from the table. They are gaining a lot from this quote-unquote starvation campaign. They're gaining international opprobrium on Israel, the potential of recognizing a Palestinian state from Britain, France, Canada, I've heard Australia, New Zealand, and others. So for them, there's really very little incentive to actually come to the table at this point. So the question is then, what does Israel do? And it seems to have taken quite a while for them to figure it out, but tomorrow it seems like it's going to happen. As is usual with decisions like this, especially when they are, decided well in advance, there's usually leaks from various quarters, from the political echelon, from the military echelon, and senior political figure usually means Netanyahu himself. Senior military figure usually means the chief of staff or someone very high up. And there seems to have been a bit of a war of words from these sources over the last few days with, first of all, the leak basically from Netanyahu's office that the prime minister is looking for the chief of staff to come up with a plan to, they say in Hebrew, lichbosh et Gaza. Now, the reason I used Hebrew is because it could be open to many different interpretations. Lichbosh can mean anything from a full occupation to conquest. It can mean conquest, it can be occupation, conquer. Any of those words in English will suffice, but obviously they mean very different things. Conquering territory is one thing, occupying it is another, and also they have legal ramifications as well. But it does seem that the more hawkish interpretation is the one that was left to stand. Let's put it that way. Perhaps the ambiguity is part of the point. This was then met by leaks from the chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, who basically said if he's instructed to do that, or if his opinion not to go for the maximalist approach is overridden, he will be left with no choice but to resign. He feels that what is intended to do will not only endanger the hostages, will also endanger the soldiers. It will mean a full-time occupation. And if you're there for a concerted amount of time, not only do you need to feed the residents, but you also need to do everything from sanitation, education, etc. So there is a feeling amongst some in the army, and by the way, in the army itself, there are various opinions on what should be the next step. And some of those have even got very, very heated between various elements at the upper echelons of the army. What we now hear the night before this important cabinet decision is probably it's going to be something much less, at least in the first stage, than the full conquest of Gaza. Don't forget, Israel probably has taken over around 70 to 75% of Gaza, or controls it, but it has left Gaza City, the major, the capital of the Strip, and where around 1 million plus residents reside, where to a certain extent life has gone on. Again, not to say it's completely as normal, but it certainly is not the same as in other parts of the Strip. There is a feeling that there are some hostages held there, not all, and maybe not even the majority, but it will involve perhaps 5 divisions to take it over for around 5 months. This is, again, something that's been leaked. But again, if we're talking about the imminency of any decision, first of all, a decision has to be made. And then Two things have to happen. First of all, they have to give the residents time to relocate. We've seen that successfully done in Rafah, and we've seen it less successfully done elsewhere. It remains to be seen what will happen to the residents of Gaza City. But also it takes time, a week or two, to get together the divisions, to call up the reservists, some of whom this might be the fifth, sixth, or seventh time they've been called up over the last 2 years. They're exhausted. They may have lost their job. They may have lost their businesses. We hear about all these terrible things that have happened over the last 2 years, and there's a lot of exhaustion amongst the reservists. So that's also taken into account by the IDF chief of staff. So what's probably happening, my impression is, again, and I've said this for the last couple of weeks, Netanyahu wants a deal. He wanted a deal a few weeks ago and was quite surprised when Hamas walked away from the table, quite surprised when Britain and France decided to put on the table, and Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister himself, basically gave Hamas an out and incentivized them not to come to the table. He was quite surprised by everything. He thought that there would be a deal, a partial deal along the so-called Witkoff outlines, but Hamas have walked away. They've shown no interest whatsoever to come back. In fact, all the voices, even from the so-called more moderate Hamas wings, those sitting in Qatar and maybe in Turkey, have actually called on Hamas to stand firm and not make any sort of a deal. So it's clear that negotiations are not in the offing. It doesn't seem like anything's happening there. So this is more of a gambit by to Netanyahu to say to Hamas two things. First of all, we will chase you anywhere. And second of all, that the hostages are not shields, are not going to be a shield to go wherever we need to go. There is a feeling in Hamas, understandably so, that the hostages have basically given them, if they hold hostages in a certain area, then the IDF does not come in, and there's not as much combat and conflict in those particular areas because the IDF is very careful, because previously some of the hostages have been killed when the IDF was getting closer to them. So Netanyahu is trying to send a message that that's no longer going to be the game. But what there is a feeling is, because it's going to take at least a week or two for anything really to happen, Hamas will remove the hostages probably from the areas that Israel is going to advance into, giving them time to put the hostages out of harm's way, but still go into an area where Hamas still controls. Hamas feels emboldened up until now to basically still control. So we'll have to see what's happened. Remarkably, the leaks and the attacks have not just taken place between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff, but also with the Prime Minister's son, as some have called him, the defense expert in Miami, making fun of the fact that Netanyahu has lived in Miami for the last few years, but seems to have an opinion on everything that's going on in Israel, and for the first time has openly attacked the Chief of Staff and basically said he was thrust on Netanyahu. We've seen throughout the war that many senior defense officials have resigned or been forced to resign, whether it's defense minister, whether it's the IDF chief of staff, whether it's the head of the Shin Bet, have all resigned because they disagreed with Netanyahu. Well, Eyal Zamir was Netanyahu's pick. Now, what Yair Netanyahu says is he was actually Defense Minister Yisrael Katz's pick, and he was thrust on Netanyahu. And Yisrael Katz said, yes, I was the one who put him forward, but clearly Netanyahu had the final say. So, it's gotten a little bit unsavory. Also, Sarah Netanyahu, apparently, allegedly, according to the news, also got involved, also said that she knew from the beginning that he would be susceptible to the pressure from the hostage families and the left, as she would have it. But there seems to be, again, that animosity between the Netanyahu circle and another senior figure in the defense establishment. Let's not forget, Eyal Zamir cannot be blamed for October 7th. He was not involved. He was not in any senior position at the time. So you can't really make that excuse. So how is the cabinet lining up tomorrow? Well, what we see and what we hear is Netanyahu and Ron Dermer, the strategic affairs minister who's very close to Netanyahu, is for the more hawkish position, along with obviously Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. On the other side, we already hear Gideon Saar the foreign minister, and we hear Aryeh Deri. Aryeh Deri is not a minister, but his opinion is quite weighted, and he's trusted by many, including Netanyahu himself. The key will be is where do the rest of the Likud ministers stand? Some of them are very uneasy about this new policy, and it will remain to be seen whether they're going to stand up and stand against Netanyahu. They haven't done it when Yuli Edelstein was fired. They haven't done it in various other times when Yoav Gallant was fired. We'll have to see what comes out of that particular event tomorrow. The US, as we've heard, is sort of standing aside on this. When President Trump was asked what he thinks about what Israel's going to do, he said it's up to the Israelis. His main goal at this point is to try and get as much humanitarian aid as possible. Some budgets have been allocated, and apparently what I've heard is there's going to be an uptick on the humanitarian foundation food pickup points from around 4 to I think 16, and perhaps they're going to be in wider areas, and they're certainly going to be necessary if this million plus Palestinians at the moment in Gaza City will relocate to the more south and the more west in the Strip. But at the moment, it does seem like the US is giving Israel, if not a green light, certainly not a red light on this. And I think they want to see what's happening. From various analysts' understanding and people close to President Trump, they say he was very affected by the release of the videos this week of 2 or 3 of the hostages who are basically skin and bones, as we saw these tragic, disgraceful pictures that have come out from the Gaza Strip, which have been considered an own goal from Hamas's PR while they're trying to show starvation. They're starving Israeli hostages. And this apparently really disturbed President Trump. And this is really, he mentioned it himself, and this is what is allowing Israel to move, to have a little bit more maneuverability. At home, on the ultra-orthodox enlistment or non-enlistment issue, Yuli Edelstein was finally officially fired. He was voted out, let's say, and he gave quite a robust speech saying that this is the death knell of any intention to recruit any IDF soldiers from the ultra-orthodox community. His replacement, Boaz Bismuth, is really trying to hit the ground running. He already is calling for a meeting next week of the Foreign and Defense Affairs Committee. You'd think the first thing he would do is hold a meeting on something related to the war, but no, he's going to hold a meeting to try and get the legislation moving as quickly as possible. He's going to try and push forward, and according to people around him, even trying to push for a law to be presented in the Knesset by October. Now, the Knesset legal advisor has put a little bit of a stop to this by saying that, you know, a law has to be properly debated, has to be many different meetings, has to be different experts before it can really be reintroduced to the Knesset. So that has ruined a little bit of the timetable, but there's always a way around it if he wants to push as many meetings as possible. But it shows once again that Netanyahu is very keen on pleasing the ultra-Orthodox wing of the government, even though they're kind of not in the government anymore. But still, he doesn't want them to really blow the whole thing up. Meanwhile, we did see one of the so-called spiritual leaders of the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, Rabbi Landau, who basically was outraged this week when some ultra-Orthodox protesters or people who are deserted and refused to go to the army were arrested and sanctions were placed against them. And he has called for an all-out global war against the state of Israel. Obviously, one can imagine opponents to that have basically said that, you know, while Israel is at war, while its soldiers are dying, getting injured, while reservists are crumbling under the pressure, and, you know, there was another few, unfortunately, suicides amongst Israeli combat soldiers this week, that instead of coming to share the burden, they're declaring war on Israel, the government, and the IDF. So there is a promise that in the weeks ahead there's going to be more meaningful demonstrations by the ultra-orthodox, perhaps even violent demonstrations, or closing off roads as they've done before, or something more. But certainly the threats are there, and it's certainly engaging the ultra-orthodox rabbinical leadership. So we'll have to see what's happening there. But the language is certainly getting very, very strong. And the days and weeks ahead will certainly be difficult. And this is the time where the ultra-Orthodox have a vacation in between Tisha B'Av, which was on Sunday, and the first of the Jewish month of Elul. This is a time where yeshivot go on holiday, and you see ultra-Orthodox all around the country traveling around, having a vacation. So there is a lot of time for them to demonstrate, to take certain measures, to follow what Rabbi Landau said, and there seems to be meetings to decide exactly what actions will take place. We'll keep an eye on that. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley. I will start with an audience question from Carrie Hillebrand, who asks, wouldn't the Army face growing refusal of reservists to be called up again, especially for such a controversial and costly offensive?
It will remain to be seen. There are different schools of thoughts on this. There has been definitely, we've seen a downtick in those who are coming to service. Just simply, they're exhausted. They feel that their lives need to be back on track. They need to be with their families. Some of them are new parents, or they're running businesses. They're independent. They rely on their work, or they've been fired. There is that general exhaustion. And there are those who also say alongside this that we're happy to come, but not just for nothing. If there's a proper aim to our coming and fighting, then we're happy to come. So there might be, if there is a real effort on the table, a real plan, people feel that and see that there's a plan finally to defeat Hamas, and it's in the offing, and it's not just a political tool to keep the coalition intact, as some accuse, or just necessary to get Hamas back to the table. Perhaps that might play into some feelings, but we have definitely seen a lowering of those who have turned up. It's not necessarily an outright refusal. There's always a way, if you want to get out of it. You can bring a doctor's note or something, or you can claim that you can have a quiet word with your commander or your commanding officer and basically say, listen, I can't do it anymore. I know people have done that, and it's not an outright refusal and say, that's it, I'm not coming, I refuse to do it. But it's just, I've got to step this one out because I just need to get back to my life. My life is crushing around me financially, socially, personally. So we'll have to see. As I said, even from the moment where a decision will be made, it will take at least a week or two to really flesh out the plans, to call up the reservists, to bring the divisions down ready to attack, and to give the Palestinian civilians time to relocate out of what will then become a combat zone.
All right, thank you. Now, another development from about a week ago, we heard a number of Arab states calling for Hamas to disarm and relinquish power in Gaza. Now, it's expected for Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt, to take this position. But what was interesting is that Qatar joined on in this demand. Can you comment on that and what that really means?
Sure. First of all, it was a decision made by, I think it was the Arab League, with all the states involved. So they had to get a unanimous decision on that. There were other parts that were more problematic, calling for a Palestinian state with Jerusalem its capital and a right of return for refugees, which is always problematic from Israel's point of view, because basically it means flooding the state of Israel with millions and millions of Arabs who've never lived in the current state of Israel, who have some claim, which no other people in the world have, that they can return to perhaps an area that maybe one of their grandparents or great grandparents once lived and fled or left or perhaps was pushed out. So there were certainly problematic parts to it, but it was, it was touted by the British and the French and others as a great achievement. It took 2 years to condemn the massacre of October 7th. So Israel was certainly not cheering it necessarily, certainly not publicly. Qatar is still seen by many as a deeply problematic player. It tries to do a lot on the PR front. It tries to play this diplomatic role as moderators, as a part of trying to help the negotiations along. But no one in Israel, very few people in Israel, under any great a sort of mirage that Qatar is a normative player in this. They're not going to join the Abraham Accords. They're not ever going to get close to Israel, at least not in the foreseeable future. So it's not dramatically, surprising. They signed on probably because more to do with internal Arab issues. They wanted, to look like they were going along with all the other Arab countries. But I don't think that will moderate Qatar's position towards Israel anytime soon.
All right, thank you. Now, Larry Greenberg asks, is Netanyahu characterizing this proposed next battle as the final one, a fight to the finish?
He doesn't use those words. First of all, he hasn't come out officially and said anything at this point. Perhaps when the decision will be made tomorrow, perhaps he will. So he's not using that language. He used the words that can be interpreted different ways in Israel. It can be limited. It can be maximalist. It can mean a full occupation. I don't think it will mean that. I think it's going to be more the minimalist approach. It's going to be stage by stage, trying to take Gaza City first. I don't think at the end of the day that Netanyahu wants this. I think he wants a deal. Now there's talk that there's going to be no more interim deals. If there's going to be a deal, it's going to be one final deal. But again, there's no real negotiation, so it's all a bit of a moot point. So I don't think Netanyahu will use that language because he knows that at any point there can be pulled from underneath him, a return to negotiations, international pressure, whatever it is. So if he uses that kind of language, then he's boxed himself in a little bit. And usually Netanyahu, politically, especially in his communications, is a little bit more clever than that. So I doubt he'll use language like that. And I don't even think that he personally believes that's what will happen. And again, my personal impression is that, again, this is part of a negotiating tool. This is to put pressure on Hamas. I think Israel is fumbling around, trying to think how it can put pressure on Hamas to come back to the table. It doesn't seem that anything they're doing is working. So they are trying to think a little bit further, a little bit more out of the box. And I think that's what has got us to this position.
All right, thank you. Going to a question now from Jose Montero, who asks, so who will defend the ultra-orthodox should the soldiers that are suffering stand up and choose not to fight?
I mean, that's the case that's made, that it's a very complicated question because the ultra-orthodox have this belief. They don't really believe it themselves, but this is the excuse they give, that their Torah learning is what defends the country just as much, if not more, than the actual soldiers. But of course, we've heard recently and we've seen recently that certain ultra-Orthodox communities have asked for more security. So you can't have it both ways. As I said, that they don't really believe it themselves, but this is what they tell themselves and tell the outside world, that they are shouldering the burden and they're doing just as much. And when Israel has a victory, it's because of their learning. And if Israel doesn't have a victory, it's because there's not enough belief and all that sort of thing. So it's not really a serious question. The Israeli soldiers, the reservists, they will come when necessary, especially if there's a need to defend Israel. The majority will come. Yes, the numbers will lower each time they're asked to come. But still, the majority of reservists are willing, are able, are motivated, and have a strong belief that what they're doing is saving lives. And while they're extremely angry about giving this blanket exemption to the ultra-orthodox community, especially after what they've been through for the last 2 years, they're not going to let that affect their decision to not show up. There's been a lot of scenes in the Knesset and elsewhere around the country of reservists who have given hundreds of days over the last 2 years confronting Likud members of Knesset and ministers and saying, what's going on? Why you keep on sending us and then you keep on exempting a whole community and keep on justifying it? There's never a good answer given. They fall back on, well, we've got to respect the Torah learners, but mostly these are not religious people, so it's really just a petty excuse, and that just angers the reservists even more. So there is growing anger against the ultra-Orthodox community from all other communities, including the religious community and the traditional community, and that's why Netanyahu wants to play this out as carefully as possible, because he knows this is one area where he can actually lose support, especially going into an election year, because even amongst the Likud, who will follow him, some will follow him to everywhere, on this issue, it is an Achilles heel, because it doesn't really serve his electoral purposes.
Okay, thank you. Going to a question now from Barak Korkmaz, who asks, is there an argument between IDF chiefs and political cadre on the war efforts?
Yes, as I started saying, there are substantial disagreements. Listen, the army is accused by certain political levels of bringing in this perception, of a smaller army, a more technical army. Hamas were deterred. If you just improve the lives of Gazans, then there's no particular reason for Hamas to attack. And October 7th really put pay to all these beliefs. If people want to understand why the Israeli public have become more hawkish, it's because there was this belief, there was this perception, there was this conception that you make the Gazan lives better, you allow more of them to come into Israel for work, you pump more food and give more freedom to Gazans, then they have no incentive to attack Israel. Well, October 7th, sent that crashing down. A lot of people feel that it was a perception perpetuated by the defense establishment. The political establishment, again, it's split. At the very top, Netanyahu portrays himself as hawkish, but when it comes to it, as I said, I think if Hamas came back to the table tomorrow, he would be there 1 minute after. But partly for reasons that will help him in negotiations, he has to look more hawkish, but also to keep his right flank, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Betzalel Smotrich, within the government. He has to also play to that. The debate in Israel is to what extent is Netanyahu only doing what he's doing in Gaza because of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir basically only interested in his own political survival. That's what a lot of his opponents have accused him of. As I said, I think he has to look hawkish because it's a negotiating tactic. And I think a lot of what will be said over the coming days is just to try and bring Hamas back to the table. So that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be the friction between the political and the defense level. And we see arguments all the time of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and others attacking the chief of staff as they attacked his predecessor. So there is certainly a great amount of tension, which makes sense during a war, especially one that's gone on for 2 years without the goals being attained at this particular point. You're on silent.
Oh, apologies. Thank you very much, Ashley. We are going now to, I think we have time for one more question here. Michael Reichenstein, I hope I pronounced that right, asks, today is the 80th anniversary of the U.S. dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. Japan was never going to surrender. Not suggesting the same means, but isn't Hamas in the same frame of mind as Japan was then?
I'm not going to get into that. I'm not a historian of that particular period. There is a case to be made that, people say, well, you can't kill an idea, you can't kill such radical ideologues. And the big debate is, the argument is, well, was Nazism or Imperial Japan any less radical? And in the end, they surrendered. There are those who say, no, Islamism, radical Islamism, is a whole different ball game, and they are far less likely to surrender no matter what you do with them. I don't know. I don't know enough about Imperial Japan, its ideology, but we know what happened. We know that they did eventually surrender. Israel is not going to go down that route. Clearly not. They've been fighting on the ground now for pretty much almost 2 years. They have the weaponry to just bomb it from the air and not lose a single soldier and not have to worry about those sort of things. But they also know that the civilian casualties in Gaza will be far, far greater. So Israel has never expressed any interest in doing something as radical as that, and nor will it. So I think that's all I can say on that particular question at this point.
All right, many thanks. Now, we have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast for the week. I want to thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time to update us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout over the weekend for our weekly podcast offerings email in your inbox for next week's podcasts. As always, I thank you all again for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.